Time is 8:54 Central African time, and we're going to be switching gears now to talk about, I think, what is the most pressing issue in the world right now. If you've been following us, you know that we've been having a really, really insightful and really, really in-depth discussion on the fragile U.S.-Iran ceasefire, which is someone hours from expiring, and hopes for diplomacy from a lot of people seem to be dimming. Iran has essentially ruled out attending the next round of US-Iran peace talks in Pakistan, Islamabad. They are accusing the United States of America of armed piracy. This comes after that seizing of an Iranian-linked ship. I think it was on Sunday, if I'm not mistaken, Sunday evening. And it's going to be interesting to see the impact of the seizing of that Iranian-mentioned ship, the Tuskar, if I'm not mistaken, in the Strait of Hormuz, the impact that will have. And US President Donald Trump once again insisting that Iran will negotiate or they will face problems like they've never seen before. And the United Nations, on the other hand, is voicing growing concerns over freedom of navigation in the Gulf, the Strait of Hormuz, the impact that has on world economies, and a warning that global trade and humanitarian supplies are already being affected. So we're going to be unpacking that. We're going to be speaking to a very, very good friend of the show and someone that has been following the events of Iran and that US-Israeli war on them quite closely. Hassen Seria, he's from Press TV. He's a correspondent and a very, very good friend of the show, veteran analyst when it comes to Middle Eastern affairs. Hassen, thank you so much for joining us. Always a pleasure having you on Salam Media. Really appreciate you giving us your time once again.
Thanks very much, Salalo. It's good to be here again.
No, the pleasure's all ours, and I think we'll jump right into it. It feels like the world is currently at limbo. If you can just bring us to speed at this current moment, the latest when it comes to the peace talks and how Iran, most importantly, plans to go about them. Have they completely been ruled out, as many seem to be suggesting, or is there hope that there might be negotiations happening in Islamabad sometime this week?
Well, I think at this point in time, from the Iranian side, it's clear that they are telling the Americans that you've not kept to the your side of the deal, your side of the bargain, as it were. For example, if we look at the situation in Lebanon, we look at the situation of this so-called naval blockade that the Americans have been imposing, the attack on that Iranian vessel as well. All of this was indications that the Americans are not serious. We understand from the American side, of course, that J.D. Vance, the deputy president, was on standby to board the flight, just waiting as such for the Iranians to give the go-ahead, the green light that they are going to be going to Pakistan, to Islamabad for the talks, the next round of talks. So the Americans seem to be sitting and waiting here, but the Iranians again showing that when they went into these ceasefire talks, as it were, that they had all of the cards in their hands, that the Iranians on the battlefield, they appeared to be having the upper hand, that the Americans, the Israelis had run short on their interceptors, for example, that there was pressure coming in from the Gulf countries as well at the time, that there was not any sort of buy-in, despite attempts by Donald Trump to get Europe or even NATO or even a number of the Western nations that would normally have supported him in trying to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, that at the UN Security Council as well, we had China and Russia that both used their veto in order to stop any moves, to take any military action as such, to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, that Iran keeps all of this in mind, that it had all of the cards in its hands, and that is exactly what it's exerting here again. It is saying that we went into those negotiations. You said that this 10-point plan that Iran had proposed, that this was a good basis for some sort of talks. What we saw play out in Islamabad was, of course, a situation where the Americans sent their vice president, but he didn't have decision making power. And we understand that just about almost every hour or so, he had to make calls back to Washington in order to get approval or some sort of go ahead from Washington in order for him to proceed in a particular direction or so. And the Americans at the same time started putting more demands on the table, such that what we ended up with and what has been presented, as well as we saw when the Iranians, clearly the 10-point plan had, for example, Lebanon and the entire resistance front being part of the ceasefire. The Americans and the Israelis then tried to sort of, through the media, reposition what that was, that Lebanon was not part of it. Eventually, we saw a ceasefire of some sort come into effect in Lebanon. That the Iranians are saying all of this shows that you're not serious about these
Mm.
negotiations. We went into this with all of the cards in our hands, and if you want to see a resumption of hostilities, then that is what we are prepared for. I don't think the Iranians even thought that they would have reached this point of the ceasefire that we saw coming into effect 2 weeks ago. The Iranians were prepared here for the long haul. They were prepared for the long war. And that is what they are saying now, that the Americans are the ones that needs these gaps, between the fighting in order to replenish supplies, in order to re-strategize and so on. But from Iran's side, we've been preparing this for about 40 years. We knew that this day was going to come. So we are ready for it. And that is, I think, the message that the Iranians are trying to send at this point.
And I think that's very, very concerning, considering the fact that we still have the Strait of Hormuz being ultimately blockaded at this point. The United States of America claim that they've put a blockade on the strait. How important is it, the fact that the strait is closed, and also the events of the past weekend where you had this merchant ship, the Tuska, being seized? Were those two events ultimately the the moment where the breakdown of the hopes of a second round of talks in Islamabad, became those two moments? Because it almost felt like going into the last days of the ceasefire that everyone was prepared for a second round of talks. As you mentioned, JD Vance was ready to make his way. The Pakistani delegation also coming out quite confidently that there'll be a second round of talks. But on Sunday, feels like that's when everything ultimately fell apart.
I think my reading was that the likelihood of a second round of talks was not going to actually be as much.
Mm,
My assessment was always, because of the situation in Lebanon, because Israel seems to try to be playing its own game here, outside of the sphere of what the Americans want as well. We mustn't lose sight of that sort of jostling there in terms of who has the upper hand in terms of deciding the trajectory of the war. And the fact that the Israelis do need to be in a state of conflict, despite the Americans realizing from an economic perspective and strategic perspective and even their global positioning that they need to end this war as soon as possible, the Israelis still show a major appetite for going ahead with the war. Maybe even not with Iran, but for continuing in Lebanon. And this is, I think, maybe to an extent the masterstroke of what the Iranians have tried to achieve here, of going for this regional peace that they put it as, that they have tied Lebanon directly to it. So I think there was always going to be that possibility that either these talks would not happen as scheduled, that there would maybe be an extension of the ceasefire to some degree, or that we'd have a resumption of hostilities. Of course, how that resumption happens, we cannot say at this point in time, because who's going to fire that opening shot
mm,
and what is going to be the trigger, that would be hard to sort of project. But I think this point that you're raising here of the attack on the Iranian vessel, because the Americans didn't here go in as they had claimed they would, that they would board the vessels that are breaking this blockade that they're trying to impose, they actually opened fire and they went for the engine room, as we've heard from those warnings that were issued from the Americans. So this indicated a major escalation, and I think, as you point out, that it came at this critical point in time showed again that there wasn't the seriousness from the Americans to pursue the negotiations at this point in time. But I think the important thing we must also keep in mind about the Strait of Hormuz. Now, what the Iranians, of course, were saying was that they've not imposed a closure of the Strait of Hormuz, that they are going to allow the passage of vessels through the Strait of Hormuz. That is largely for trade purposes, but there are new conditions that persist. And part of this is, of course, those fees that Iran is imposing, which it says it needs to use for rebuilding of the country after the devastation of the war. It is also saying that it will not allow, for example, hostile ships. So from countries such as the United States, or from entities such as Israel, that it will not allow these type of vessels to pass through the strait. Now, looking at the Strait of Hormuz itself from a purely Iranian perspective, or the strait itself, those are actually territorial waters of Iran and Oman. So these two countries have the full right to impose any sort of restrictions on it. This is their territorial waters. It's like South Africa saying, these ships can pass through our waters. The problem with the strait is, because it's a choke point, of course, there's the issue of whether international movement of vessels can pass through for the sake of trade. And of course, that is a point of contention, because both the United States as well as Iran have not ratified the United Nations treaty on the open seas. So this technically means that Iran is not obligated, it is not bound by this treaty, that it must allow these type of ships going through the strait as well. We also have certain instances, for example, like in in Turkey, for example, the Dardanelles, as well as the Bosporus Straits, where there are fees that do apply for movement of ships through those sort of waterways. So that is what the Iranians are trying to achieve here. And as we know, for example, South Africa as well, they've told South Africa that the strait is not closed to you for movement of your ships as long as you fulfill these conditions. Looking at this from the American side, however, what the Americans have tried to do is impose a siege, a blockade of Iranian ports. They again saying they're not blocking ships from moving through the strait, which isn't their right in any case, because it is not the high seas or the open seas or international waters. They're saying they're blocking ships from going to Iranian ports or leaving from Iranian ports, which is essentially a form of sanctions that the Americans are trying to impose here. But from an international law perspective, the Americans do not have any jurisdiction to do this, because it opens up into the open seas. It also does not have UN Security Council sort of backing or approval to conduct this. And even for this overall war, Donald Trump hasn't even gotten congressional approval in the United States. So the United States here, according to international law, is essentially carrying out piracy. But I think the bigger challenge that the Americans face here is, before you can say you're trying to impose some sort of a blockade, you first have to ensure the opening of the strait, that there is free flow of the vessels. And that is what the Iranians have not relinquished. The Iranians still have that control. The Americans have failed through multiple means, as we mentioned a bit earlier in the interview. So that is the situation that you're sitting with. And that is, it shows, I think, a level of desperation from the Americans. And that is what we saw escalate into this attack on this Iranian vessel over the weekend. And that is what brings you to this point, that the Americans have not changed in the equations on the ground. That we see, okay, the cost of the international price of oil has come down, but that is because of other factors. But as far as the movement of vessels through the Strait of Hormuz, that we're going to see us moving back to what was before the war and so on, that has not changed. And that card is squarely still in the hands of the Iranians. So I think all of this indicated already that there's not going to be that likelihood for those talks or those meetings to happen in Islamabad. One more point on this, I think, is that the Americans haven't changed their team. They're still sending Jared Kushner. They're still sending um, uh, uh, um, the Steve Witkoff as well to these talks, and those have been seen to be two of the main sort of sticking points here, because those two individuals have been presenting arguments in the interest of Israel rather than of the United States, and we know their ties to the Zionist regime. So these all, I think, to the Iranians show that there's not a seriousness, that there's no change. J.D. Vance doesn't have the capability, he doesn't have the authorization to take any decisions. So really, this is going to be a wasted exercise, and I think that all indicated to us that we are looking at the possibility of a resumption of hostilities once more.
Very, very concerning state of affairs if that is the case. I want to come back to a very, very important point that you made. The fact that Iran has been prepared for this for almost 40 years. They've, waited for a day like this. They have measures in place. And it almost feels like the narrative within Iran itself has shifted from negotiation to almost resistance. How would you assess the quote unquote pain tolerance of the Iranians? Because at this point, you'd expect their leadership to be scrambling for a negotiation, for a permanent ceasefire. More than 3,000 people have been dead. There's devastating damage to infrastructure. But they're seemingly the ones that are saying we are not going to be negotiating unless these terms are met. And we feel the United States of America is coming to the table in good faith.
So yeah, the Iranians have prepared for this for over 40 years. They knew from those very early days after the revolution that when they were isolated, when they were attacked, when they saw, for example, the attack in 1980, 1981 on the leadership of the Iranian revolution, over 70 of the key leaders, even the deputies that were killed in that bombing attack, for example, that they knew that we have to prepare and we've got to protect ourselves. So they saw it during the Iran-Iraq war as well, when the entire world stood against Iran, and Iran, being just coming out of the revolution, had to defend itself for that 8-year period. So the Iranians have prepared for this. And I think if we were to assess, for example, during the war itself, the Americans and the Israelis banked on the Iranian people turning against the government, and sort of from
Mm,
within them seeing some sort of a revolt from the people, and that was going to cause the toppling of the government. And that, of course, after having taken out the leader, Sayyid Khamenei. But that did not happen. What we saw, on the contrary, was that when the Iranians opened up and the Americans were talking about a ground invasion, the over 20 million Iranians actually signed up online to say, I am ready to defend my country, that I am going to
mm,
go to the battlefield, whether with training or whatever. But this is a issue of national pride. This is an issue of national identity and our independence. We saw over the recent days as well the women of Iran, because it was they marked their Daughters' Day, and we saw all of the women coming out into the streets, and women carrying their guns, and women showing that even if it comes to that, we will be willing to take up arms. What the Iranians are also following, as they've outlined, is a strategy of decentralized mosaic defense, as they put it, which they say they've been working on for over 20 years now. And what this means is that they're not only looking at Iran as one sort of coherent, sort of as a country, as an individual body, where there is a top structure of command from your army that is filtering down the strategies and the information to the rest of the branches. They have broken the country into 30 different sort of regions. And each of these militaries within each of these regions also have the right to take decisions. So if, for example, the Americans do succeed in some ways, let's assume Isfahan, where they tried to stage that ground operation. If they were, for example, able to take over Isfahan, that will not place the Iranian army or Iran in a situation where it will cause them such a military concern that they will not be able to handle it, because the command in Isfahan itself will be able to start taking decisions in terms of
Mm,
what sort of military strategy it must follow, and all of the regions around them as well. So if we want to think of it in a more simplistic way, it is like you've got Ansarullah, you've got Hezbollah, you've got Hamas, you've got Islamic Jihad all across the region. This would break Iran into 30 more resistance movements that all will be able to
mm,
take their own decisions in terms of what strategy. So this indicates to you that the Iranians have thought to this extent that even if the country starts disintegrating, the resistance will continue up until that last bullet. And I think that gives us an indication of what the Iranians are prepared for here. That these talks and so on, yes, this is part of the process. That if there is opportunity to resolve the situation in that way, that is perhaps a better way to do so. I think also when we look at many military conflicts, the conflict goes on the battlefield up to a certain point. We never ever have a clear victory or a clear outcome in which we can say one party has moved into a country and it has taken over. We can look at countries like Afghanistan and Iraq and so on as well. But there comes a point where the end of hostilities has to be claimed, or some sort of negotiation has to be entered into because of the situation on the ground, which dictates what the next step must be. And I think that is what we're going to see with the Iranian situation. The fact that the Iranians have been able to make such a big impact on the global economy as well is probably also what's going to cause for nations such as in Europe and that, which have shown that there's no appetite for them to get involved in this conflict actively, which they normally are. I mean, the Europeans, as seen in Libya, in Iraq, in many countries, as soon as the Americans start striking, they are ready to strike. But they realize that with Iran, that there are consequences, and they're already feeling and seeing the impact of that, not just on the battlefield, but also on the international economic arena as well. So, because of this, there's a totally different sort of outlook here, I think, from those parties, and I think that changes the game here to an extent. But the Iranians, as you've asked, clearly, right down to individual provinces and right down to over 20 million people, they are willing to fight for their country, whatever may come.
I think it's going to be really, really interesting times ahead as that countdown clock to the ceasefire comes to an end. And it's a situation that we'll be monitoring quite closely, Hassan. Thank you so much for joining us. Always a pleasure having you on Salam Media, and hope we chat again soon.
Thank you, Sonado.
There you go, Hassen Seria, Press TV, South African correspondent, giving us, I think, a lowdown and insight of the current Israeli-US war on Iran, and most importantly, what looks and feels like a breakdown in the second round of talks. We'll be monitoring the story quite closely, and we'll see what will ultimately happen when that ceasefire deal comes to an end. It was 10 days, if I'm not mistaken. Who'll be striking first? And what will the implications of that be, not just for Iran, but also for the whole world, most importantly, us here in the global south, how we should be reacting to this new turn of events. And we'll be following those developments out in the Middle East quite closely. You can continue to follow Salam Media on our various social media pages. Otherwise, going to take a quick break. When we come back, we'll be back with more after this.